Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, The Future of Missile Defense, sponsored by Raytheon Missiles and Defense on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Tay Fitzgerald, the Vice President for Strategic Missile Defense at Raytheon Missiles and Defense. Now, Tay, before break, we were talking a little bit about the strategic review that's coming up. Obviously, there's a lot to expect from it. One of the things that the review obviously will have to take upon is how the threats have really evolved over time. And not just the threats, you talked about cruise missiles as an example, but also how that missile system then has to respond to the evolving threats. What are you seeing from that piece, and what are some of those considerations DoD needs to keep in mind about the evolution of the missile system?
Yeah, so really good point, because not only does the missile system need to evolve, right, but the entire infrastructure is going to have to evolve to deal with this, again, very rapidly emerging hypersonic as well as cruise missile threats. I think the most important thing for everyone to realize, and I know that MDA has bought into this, is we're going to have to take both a evolutionary and a revolutionary approach. Today, we have some awesome sensing capability, transportable sensors with very good tracking, discrimination, detection capability. We also have very capable sensors deployed, both land and sea. A great example of an evolutionary capability would be closing the fire control loop around more of those sensors, more of those effectors today in a much more rapid manner, right? At the same time, we need to have an eye to the future, much more revolutionary technologies, and part of what we're doing to enable that is to make sure that we do our designs today using digital engineering, open systems architecture, modular design, so that we can readily upgrade the hardware that we're building today instead of taking the 10, 15, even 20-year cycles to field new weaponry. For example, we are investing in high-powered microwave today. We can't in the future assume that we're going to be able to take out all threats with a single shot. We have to assume that hypersonics are going to proliferate to the point that we have to have multiple kills with a single shot. And to do that, you're going to have a technology, a revolutionary technology like high-powered microwave, which is not going to be trivial to get into a small effector. No matter how powerful your effector is, if you don't have persistent, wide-ranging sensing capability, space, and on the ground across the world, you're never going to see the threat. It's extremely important to get eyes on the threat early and to be able to maintain that track and discrimination throughout. So we also have to have upgrades in the sensing capability. And none of that works if you don't have a robust C2 capability. So it's really the entire architecture. It's another point that can't be lost is how much we're going to have to work with our partners around the globe to get that in place, to get that distributed network sensing capability in place.
All right, a lot to unpack there. Let me maybe take a half a step back and start with that digital engineering piece. Open systems architecture, modular, you hear that a lot in, again, the quote-unquote normal world of IT. In this weapon system world, is there such thing as open systems architecture? Is that something that has proliferated over the last few years?
So proliferated might be too strong of a word, right? But we are industry, the defense industry. There are committees, working groups, councils defining common standards, right? Most of our weapons sensors have common building blocks that we can define true modular systems around, get agreement on what those interfaces are, get agreement on what those communication protocols are. So the industry has been moving that way for quite some time, I shouldn't say independent of the government, but in concert with the government. But we haven't waited for DoD to define that for us. We're working it collaboratively because it's in our best interest to do so. So not there yet, but definitely moving in that direction.
I went to the recent Defense Information Systems Agency DISA Industry Day, and one of the things that the messages they sent, and there was a couple hundred people. It was one of the best events. I could go on all day about that, but they were like, we don't need more things. We need better integration of things or more capabilities from those things that already exist. I know weapon systems is a little different, but the integration piece is key. I'm sure you have, the old term frenemies, right?
Yep.
Competitors that you were, competimates, right? That you work with, but you also compete against, but your widget has to fit with their widget, and if they don't, DoD is going to be like, I don't want either widget, and
Correct.
that affects everyone. And that's where I think why this modular approach, open systems architecture comes in. Are you finding that more and more that DoD is requesting that kind of integration? They're demanding it?
Yeah, I was going to say, I wouldn't say requesting, I would say requiring. Right? Definitely the expectation requirement, is that we have open systems architecture. And again, we largely define that among our competimates because it's in all of our interests to do that. intellectual property is also a continuing discussion. The government's no longer interested in being tied up with a single vendor for 30, 50 years, as anyone could understand.
I don't think there are going to be too many with the B-52 bombers that have just been redone over and over and over again. I don't think we'll get those in too often.
Correct.
The other piece that I want to talk about is this idea of we talked a little bit about C2, we talked a little bit about get eyes on the threat early and better sensors. Is there a move toward mobile sensors? I mean, things I think are already mobile to a certain extent, or a large extent, but is that part of it, that you're not just setting up a radar and then hopefully you pick the right spot to see something's coming? Like what is the evolution happening with that sensor piece?
So we definitely do have transportable radars today, exactly to your point, right? Making those radars more capable is we talked about evolutionary versus revolutionary. So making those radars more capable would be the evolutionary piece, making their power requirements less stringent so that they're more mobile, part of that evolutionary piece. The revolutionary part of sensors is, of course, space.
Yeah.
Right? The movement of the space layer. And again, how are we going to tie that layer, that sensing layer, in with the rest of the system, ground-based, sea-based, submarines? You have to think about that as well.
What role, and maybe this is something that you all maybe haven't spent a lot of time on yet, but the Space Force with the new creation of the other military service, are they playing a bigger role in this review? Can you tell yet? How big of a part of it with the Missile Defense Agency?
So relative to the review, I can't speak to that part, their input to that, but relative to the Missile Defense Agency, I do believe that the agencies are working collaboratively extremely well and have roles and responsibilities defined very well. Vice Admiral Hill, again, explained that extremely effectively, where Space Force is putting up the infrastructure to detect the threat, where MDA, Vice Admiral Hill, is going to shoot it down. So, clear division of responsibilities.
I think you need that so you're not sending missiles at the same time or some way to countermeasures. Let's talk about allies for a second, because I think that's a really key piece. So as I was doing a little bit of research, one thing that occurred to me that I read was, when you talk about homeland defense, which we're talking mostly about today, protecting the nation from a missile attack, you also have to talk about protecting allies in Western Europe and in other parts of the world. And that's a different perspective than protecting against, from, for instance, the CONUS part of the protection piece. How is Western Europe and even Israel and the Middle East, as an example, how are they different, requiring a different set of thinking?
So for the overseas contingent, the same desirements that we have, protecting their homeland, making sure that we are working together, again, collaboratively, make sure we're working together as an integrated team. Obviously, policy differences between the countries can open doors for complications, but I think by and large, almost back to the modular open system discussion, trying to establish common interfaces, common infrastructure, common goals, trying to lay out a coordinated investment strategy, try to lay out a coordinated policy strategy. So I think we're still working through that. I think MDA is still working through what that layered defense architecture should look like for the away game, so to speak. But I do, again, think that falls in the category of we have systems today that can serve that purpose and revolutionary ideas as well. That will take closer examination of policy differences.
Do you get a sense as well as whether the review that DoD is going through now will address OCONUS? Or is it just CONUS?
I can't speak to that.
You can't say, okay. I wasn't sure, because a lot of times, I mean, as you read through it and some of the testimony that's happened, they definitely address both of those in that. I guess something that we'll have to go back and look forward to. The other piece around is data, of course. We talked a little bit about the importance of JADC2 or whatever C2 environment. How does that get impacted with allies too? You mentioned the need for common architectures or policies. The data piece is really key, because somebody in Western Europe, an ally, will see a missile alert maybe sooner than we could, and have to make sure they can tell us very quickly.
Yeah, this goes back to us, the need for a common roadmap, a need for common investment and definitions, right? We have a hard enough time here making sure that we can talk between our different agencies, between our different services, and then you bring in the international piece. It definitely adds a layer of complexity that we're going to have to continue to work through.
We talked a lot about today the review and kind of the build up to it. Okay, so here we are. It's February or March, whenever it comes out. These things tend to take time, we know that. What happens? What should people start looking forward in 2022 and beyond?
Yeah, so I think from an industry standpoint, I don't expect any big surprises. We work very closely with MDA. I think we understand their care-abouts, their needs, the threat, again, going forward. So I don't expect any surprises from an industry standpoint. From a review standpoint, I know there's going to probably be a lot of congressional hearings, a lot of discussion that feeds into the budgets going forward. And I think that's the influence on the 2024 budget and beyond is where we would expect to see the biggest impact and where we're going to be watching closely.
Again, doing some research, I saw that from the 2017 review that really didn't get released to 2019. There was a feeling, at least among some of the experts that I read, about that not a lot changed. Do you expect that this 2021 review to really take into account that we're still kind of playing off the same strategy as 2017 and things should be a lot different? I know I'm asking you to predict the future a little bit. So.
Yeah. So a lot, I think, would be a stretch from.
That's relative, yes.
Yes, exactly. Our government does not tend to take, hard right turns. That said, some of what we're seeing in the press puts a whole new urgency in dealing with these emerging hypersonic threats. So to say that we're going to see little to no change, I would be quite surprised.
I think that if there's, again, they release it and no one does anything with it, that's a bigger maybe question, challenge.
Correct.
Than making some important change. The other piece that I think we should touch upon here is the workforce side of it. And I think this is important because you need the people who understand how the technology works. You, as Raytheon, has to hire people who understand how the technology works. We always hear about the workforce shortage in cybersecurity as an example. What's that like for Raytheon or whomever else in this market? Are we putting out enough people who can understand missile technology, or engineers, or whatever we call these folks, rocket scientists?
That is a constant concern. We're very fortunate in our industry because we have a mission. We have a compelling mission. I always like to say, we're doing algorithms to protect the homeland, to protect the country, not to sell more socks, right? And I think that, recruiting can sometimes be a challenge because sometimes, especially the younger generation doesn't necessarily connect to that right off the bat. But in general, once we do get people in and they do see, first of all, cutting edge technology, very few industries do the technology we do. And then the cause, we don't tend to have as much trouble retaining people as maybe some industries.
I think part of it also is once they kind of understand what Raytheon or the missile defense industry does, it's kind of like, oh, that's kind of cool. And it kind of makes that retainment a little bit easier.
It does.
Tay, we're just about out of time before I let you go. What do you think the message is that DoD, that the administration, that more broadly the market should keep in mind around this review and where the future of missile defense is heading?
I think the most important thing is that the threats are changing. The technology and the application of that technology has to change with it, and there has to be some urgency around that change. Right? And I think if we work in a collaborative manner across industry and again with our allies, we can make those changes, but they do need to come, and they do need to come quickly.
I think urgency is the key word we hear a lot of times. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today, so let me thank my guest. Tay Fitzgerald is the Vice President for Strategic Missile Defense at Raytheon Missiles and Defense. Tay, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion, The Future of Missile Defense, sponsored by Raytheon Missile and Defense on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Raytheon.